looted everything and now the third world's gone. The water's poison where I'm from, the third world, son. 700 children died by the end of the song. Revolution will come where I'm from, the third world, son. Constant occupation leaves the third world torn. I'm from where the only place democracy's acceptable is if America's candidate is electable.
Actually, this whole question of the food crisis comes up in connection with the uprisings there's been with the Arab Spring, because these have been very much set off by increasing food prices that people couldn't afford to pay. And it isn't the first time that food scarcities and unavailability has led to uprisings. The French Revolution was triggered by a bread crisis. You remember Marie Antoinette saying they couldn't possibly eat cake. And in Rwanda, the terrible genocide that took place there was actually triggered by a collapse in the world price of coffee, which was Rwanda's principal export and on which its whole economy was dependent. And it was in that situation of despair that this violence was set off. And what you have to notice is that in the absence of a communist party which is able to give direction to the movement of the angry and the desperate, that movement often expresses itself in counterproductive and terrible ways, as was the massacre in Rwanda. But Jimmy Carter, I thought that was quite a good quotation. There can be no peace until people have enough to eat. Hungry people are not peaceful people. And we can see today that there are 1 billion people in the world suffering from chronic hunger, and a further 2 billion are estimated to be malnourished. That includes about 30% of Africa's population, and about 3.5 million children under 5 in developing countries die from undernutrition-related causes every year. In Haiti, things are so bad that people actually make cakes and biscuits out of mud. That is, and I'm sure that's not the only place, just to satisfy the pangs of hunger, but obviously not getting any nutrition from them. The problem's actually getting worse. Prices of cereals are going through the roof. And here are statistics on what's happened to the price of wheat recently. It's gone up by 54% in Kyrgyzstan, 45% in Bangladesh, 7% in Tajikistan. This is in 6 months. A third in Mongolia, 19% in Azerbaijan, 16% in Sudan, and 16% in Pakistan. And I was looking at the Daily Telegraph yesterday, an article by Emma Rowley, which says that according to a report backed by the United Nations, over the coming decade the price of corn will be 20% higher than the previous 10 years. The price of poultry will be 30% higher. Butter prices will rise even quicker, more than 45% in the next decade, more than 45% more expensive than in the last, and so right across the board for all the various products. But what's surprising is that, believe it or not, there's no actual shortage of food at the moment. With the global grain production at a little over 30 kilograms a person, more than enough to supply the 230 kilograms per person per year needed for an adequate calorific intake, if, and this is obviously a big if, the grain were equitably distributed. And that's taken from one of the 2 books upon which I've mainly relied in preparing this presentation. One is Fred Magdoff and Brian Tokar, Agriculture and Food in Crisis, that's published by the Monthly Review Press from New York last year. And another one is Julian Cribb, The Coming Famine, which is University of California Press at Los Angeles, also last year. So we've got all this food. Of course, nutrition does require more than just grain, but there's also plenty of food production that's not directly or indirectly grain dependent, such as the production of food and vegetables, fish from the sea, and so on and so forth. So, you know, how come that we have got this shortage in the midst of plenty? Well, There are four sort of mechanical reasons, if you like, and all of them can be justified. First, there's terrible waste. Second, grains are used to produce high protein, fewer calories to eat, but at a higher cost. Then food is diverted to the production of biofuels. And thirdly, there's an overall decline in the amount of grain that the world can produce per capita. So, because of these various factors, the apparent sufficiency of grain production transforms itself into severe shortages, and it's these shortages that have given rise to these price rises, which put increasing numbers of the poor in the situation of not being able to afford. So we see that the food import bills of the least developed countries jumped 30% from 2005 to 2006, and another to 37% between 2007 and 2008. Their food import bill was $17.9 million in 2007 and $24.6 million in 2008. The annual food import basket in least developed countries cost more than 3 times that of 2000, not because of the increased volume of food imports, but as a result of rising food prices. And the effect of this is to add 75 million people to the ranks of the hungry, and it drove an estimated 125 million people in the developing countries into extreme poverty. Well, in addition to that, all this waste is ecologically disastrous. It takes the Earth a year and 4 months to regenerate what humanity consumes in 12 months. So if you could eliminate waste, then those two could equate themselves, because the level of waste is so huge. And considerable blame for the overshoot lies with the wasteful diets of the relatively well-off. And the relatively well-off, strangely enough, includes the junk food diets of the poor in the rich countries, because these contain large quantities of animal products, far in excess of what's desirable for a healthy diet, producing obesity and disease, like those ice creams.
It couldn't be helped.
But it has been estimated that as many as 3 out of every 5 of the children presently coming through school in the well-off world are destined to die as a result of what they eat from a host of chronic disorders that result from overnutrition. So be warned. So, as I shall explain later, food production and distribution have been falling into the grip of predatory imperialist multinationals whose sole purpose is profit. And you see, it's so much easier to get profits by force-feeding the relatively wealthy than it is by catering to the basic needs of the poor. So left to the tender mercies of capitalism with its drive for profits, the system of food production and distribution not only condemns millions of people to starvation, but in addition causes massive ecological devastation that's likely to cause apocalyptic conditions for the next generation, as I shall demonstrate to you shortly. Now, monopolization of food, I've mentioned that food production is being taken over by the big multinationals. And according to Philip Michael in The World Food Crisis and Historical Perspective, food stocks are highly centralized. 5 corporations, control 90% of the international grain trade. 3 countries produce 70% of exported corn, and the 30 largest food retailers control 1/3 of world grocery sales. Now that is monopolization. More than that, the scale of the monopolist firms is staggering. In 2007, the food processor Nestle posted a profit of 9.7 billion, and this is greater than the 2000 GDP of the 65 poorest countries. Walmart, who is the world's largest grocer, posted profits of $13.3 billion for the fiscal year ending on the 31st of January 2009. And that's more than the 2007 GDP of almost half the countries in the world, in profits alone. You know, So with this market power, of course, and the significance of it, comes the ability both to predict and to some extent to actually set prices. It also, you have the political clout to affect trade and investment policy in many more of the more than 100 countries in which the biggest firms operate, and the power to keep would-be competitors at bay. So why does this matter? Well, the giant monopolies come to control the government, to dictate policy of the countries in which they operate, and of course their demands are going to be to implement policies which will maximize the monopoly's profits, regardless of the interest, and indeed normally at the expense of the people that these governments are supposed to represent. And this lust for profit regularly obliterates measures needed to preserve water or soil quality, quantity and quality in the interests of future production requirements. Then secondly, these governments operate internationally to promote the interests of giant monopolies. It's in the interests of agribusiness that have driven the governments of imperialist countries to impose structural adjustment programs through the WTO, World Trade Organization, through the International Monetary Fund, and through the World Bank. And these structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, bear heavy responsibility for the rising price of staples that beset the oppressed countries today. And it, of course, explains the neoliberal policies of imperialist government promoted through these organizations. At the Uruguay round of trade negotiations in '86, which set up the WTO, various governments signed an agreement on agriculture, which was the first multilateral agreement to create binding rules on agricultural trade. And these are the excuses that they give. It's actual straightforward looting, but it's all dressed up in pretty colours. And this is the argument. The argument that tied food security to unfettered trade went something like this: liberalise world agricultural markets by ending subsidies in inefficient producers, tear down tariff walls, end the practice of holding government-controlled food stocks. World market supplies will then move to where need is greatest. In turn, world food prices for agricultural commodities will rise, which will be good for farmers who are profitable in the deregulated markets. At the same time, consumers will pay less, benefiting from the efficiencies created by sharper competition. And environmental efficiencies are gained by concentrating production of particular crops in countries that have the greatest comparative advantage. And private companies are able to manage the business of getting food from where it's grown to where it's needed, cutting significant costs out of government budgets in those countries where the state used to play all or some of this role. Oh, it's win-win, if you only accept a structural adjustment program and hand yourself over to imperialism. But of course, what happens in practice is that the imperialist countries continue to protect their own industries and agriculture with a whole load of subsidies, while dismantling the protection of the oppressed countries. Oppressed countries were forced to abandon their tradition of accumulating public food stocks that had previously offered a defense against shortages. The way that had worked is that the stocks helped stabilize prices, as the government would buy up food stocks at times of excess supply, thereby maintaining a reasonable price for the farmers, but release the food at times when the supply was insufficient, to stop there being excessive price rises. But these government interventions, well, the imperialists didn't like at all, because they were standing in the way of maximization of profit. And so, whenever anybody had to borrow money or anything from an imperialist country, they were told, right, we'll lend it to you, but only if you dismantle these protections. And the result was that by 1998, according to the FAO, net food importing oppressed countries experienced a 20% price rise. And it's interesting to remember here the words of the Keynesian Joan Robinson, who at least got one thing right. She said, when Ricardo set out the case against protection, he was supporting British economic interests. Free trade ruined Portuguese industry. Free trade for others is in the interests of the strongest competitor in world markets, and a sufficiently strong competitor has no need for protection at home. So let's have a look at an example of how free trade impacts on oppressed countries. And I thought this was very interesting. So corporations pioneered factory-scale animal production in the United States, displaced many independent hog, cattle and poultry farmers, and they're now also producing abroad. They achieve low costs of production by having very large facilities, relatively few staff obviously, controlling and providing all the feed and medicine, and mandating that the people raising the animals essentially work as labourers under contracts favourable to the corporation. And they pass on responsibility for manure and other waste, i.e. they ignore it completely. They let somebody else deal with that at their cost. Now, a typical firm is Smithfield, a Virginia-based Fortune 500 corporation. It's used its power and connections to expand into Eastern Europe. And in the space of a few years, about 90% of Romania's and 56% of Poland's hog farmers were put out of business because of competition from Smithfield, creating social as well as environmental havoc. In addition, frozen pork products are exported to West Africa, Liberia, Equatorial Guinea and the Ivory Coast, where local producers are also put out of business. And Smithfield receives export incentive funds from Poland and sells its pork at about half the price sought by local producers in Ivory Coast. Well, I think that's such a very concrete example of how imperialism ruins the poor. And you'd think that if you were worried about sustainability, you'd be encouraging people to keep pigs locally. Pigs are very good because they eat waste products. All this stuff that's being binned can be fed to pigs, and then you eat the pig. It's brilliant. And you want to keep one in your garden. You don't want them in some farm in America or wherever. The imperialist produced food is obviously cheaper, but the economic activity of the target country has been shot to pieces by a multitude of imperialist interventions, such as Smithfield's, as a result of which increasing numbers of people can't even pay for the lower prices for the cheaper meat. And one bourgeois professor who just in the end couldn't resist the evidence of his own eyes was Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. He was initially an enthusiastic supporter of free trade as the cure for all ills, but in the light of experience he had the honesty and the humility to revise his views somewhat. What he concluded is that the whole thing was based on the idea that if you take away the government from the poorest of the poor, that somehow these markets will solve the problems. But markets can't step in and won't step in when people have nothing. And I think that is the, you can emphasize that phrase, markets can't step in and won't step in when people have nothing. And if you take away help, you leave them to die. Actually, it should be take away the government's help from the poorest of the poor. Right. So not only do prices rise because the stabilization mechanisms practiced by governments have been forcibly dismantled, but also because of straightforward and time-honored monopolist practice of price fixing. And an example of this is given by Philip Michael, talking about the production of tortillas in Mexico. When corn prices fell continuously following NAFTA's liberalization of corn imports from the United States, tortilla prices tripled during the 1990s. And during 2006, when world corn prices did rise rapidly, tortilla prices doubled again. How could that be? Corn was so much cheaper. But only 2 food processors controlled 97% of the industrial corn flour market. And the state reducing food subsidies and tortilla riots have become part of the political landscape, spurred by a 10% reduction in wages resulting from rural migrants displaced by corn imports.
Excellent. Rising prices and wages going down.
Yeah.
It's a capitalist dream.
Isn't it just? So it was through a structural adjustment programme, needless to say, that support was withdrawn from peasant farmers, alongside NAFTA-imposed trade liberalisation, with tragic results which are pretty obvious. So, but you'll be glad to hear that if the poor old masses are hit by starvation, you can look at the pages of the financial press and you'll see that the agribusinesses are making lovely profits, 10%, 15% record profits.
Well, that's a relief.
Yes, isn't it just? So what pays your pension? An intriguing question escaped many observers. How on earth did Mexicans who live in the land where the corn was first domesticated, how did they become dependent on imports of US corn in the first place? Now let me say a little bit more about the question of waste, because you're going to be really, really shocked. In 2005, BBC Radio 4 broadcast a programme which was quite wittily entitled Costing the Earth. And using figures produced by DEFRA and the National Farmers Union, it graphically exposed the egregious waste of food that's happening every day in the UK alone. Are you aware that in our lovely country 30 to 40% of all food produce is binned?
What percentage?
30 to 40. Not in your house. Tesco says it sent 131,000 tonnes of waste to landfill in 2004, which the majority was food. And Sainsbury's, which does at least distribute food to more than 400 charities, said it sent 91,000 tonnes to landfill, of which at least 70,000 tonnes is believed to be waste food. Meanwhile, we have the saga of Sasha Hall. Here she is, one in the middle, and she was put on trial for theft on charges of having helped herself in January this year to £215 and 16 pence worth of food, including 100 packs of ham, from Tesco dustbins in Great Baddow. Well, the police sent the Tesco sent the police to find her. You know, they raided her home and they hauled her away in handcuffs. In the end, she pleaded guilty on the 21st of June to receiving stolen goods, and she was given a conditional discharge. That conditional discharge, I was just looking it up before we got here, it is actually a criminal conviction, so she's got a criminal record as a result of it. It does mean that nothing will happen to her provided she doesn't reoffend. If she does reoffend, they might give her an additional punishment in respect of having helped herself to ham from the Tesco's dustbins.
Because the rubbish belonged to the disposal people.
No, the rubbish actually still belongs to Tesco's. It's on their premises. Yeah. So theoretically, I mean, you can imagine that if you've thrown away a gold bracelet by mistake, you might go hunting through your dustbin in order to find it. It's still yours.
Is it yours if it's on the road, if it's in a black plastic bag by the side of the road?
I wouldn't have thought so at that stage. I think you would have abandoned it by
Very
then.
important point about ownership.
But I would have thought that if you put it in the bin, you have actually abandoned your claims to ownership, and I would have decided the case differently had it been me. But then I think there's probably some reason why I never quite made it to being a judge.
There are two allegedly communist judges, but they're all revisionists, and they even dropped that as soon as they became judges.
Right, and your next point?
But what Tesco's have managed to do on behalf of all the monopolist food retailers is to establish the principle it's illegal for anybody to help themselves to waste food. Everybody must pay for what they get, whether they can afford to do it or not. And where is the cheapest place to buy? Why, your friendly Tesco supermarket.
Let that be an example.
Anyway, supermarkets, they've been between them some 500,000 tonnes of food a year. UK farmers trash up to 40% of their crops, you know, because anything they grow that isn't supermarket shaped to the exact specification is ploughed back into the land.
Yes.
Wasting food costs the average British household £35 a week. And globally, a third of fruit and vegetables grown actually never reach the customers. They, rot in warehouses. They, and 4,600 calories per person per day is harvested in all, but only 2,000 actually passes the lips. And to sort of summarize that, produced, which is there, 600 are lost immediately following the harvest through rotting, lack of storage facilities or whatever. 1,700 is then used for animal feed, which leaves 2,300, to which you can add 500 that comes from meat and dairy produce, leaving 2,800 calories per head, which is enough to make anybody fat if only it were fairly distributed, which it isn't, of course. Now, in addition to that, we've got the problem of biofuels. If you add biofuels to the equation, that the fossil fuels are running out, what's going to happen to our motor cars? What's going to happen to our nasty bomber planes? How are they going to be fueled in the future? Well, let's turn food into fuel, obviously. President Bush embraced agrofuel development with total commitment. In 2007, the US Congress passed the Energy Independence and Security Act, which aims to facilitate increasing US agrofuel production from 4.7 billion gallons in 2007 to over 36 billion in 2022. And Obama is just following in the same footsteps. And we can see what effect that's likely to have. So in 2008, 30% of US corn was converted into ethanol. Half of Brazil's sugarcane crop is converted into fuel. And European companies have been acquiring land in developing countries, up to 5 million hectares, which is an area the size of Denmark, the whole of Denmark, just to produce biofuel. Well, that is really snatching food out of the mouth of babes, isn't it? But, it's a futile exercise. This is the other thing that, even if the world's entire supply of carbohydrates, grains and sugar, if they were all used to produce biofuel, this would only replace 40% of world petrol consumption. So it's not really a method of substituting for fossil fuels. And on current trends, the conversion of food into biofuels would raise food prices to such an extent that the number of people suffering from hunger would rise by 50% from 1 billion to 1.5 billion. So it's a totally lunatic scheme. The corn required to fill an SUV tank just once with bioethanol would feed a person for a year.
What? Sorry, say that again, Alan.
One of these big gas-guzzling cars. You fill its fuel, the corn that you would require turned into ethanol so that this machine could burn it. One tank load, if you kept the corn
one
instead,
tank in one SUV.
Yeah.
One tank in one SUV once.
Would feed a person for a year. And what happens is that the owners of motor vehicles can effectively demand food and petrol. They've got money, and their needs are always going in a capitalist society to come before the interests of people who haven't got money, who've been impoverished and left destitute. At the moment, okay, the food isn't being equitably distributed, it's being outrageously wasted. It all goes to the people who can pay, while the people who can't pay starve. But the methods by which it's produced under conditions of market capitalism and imperialism are actually destroying the Earth's ability to produce food, and that I needed to look at in a little bit more detail. And the issues are that water is disappearing, soil is disappearing, fertilizer is disappearing, and the sea is being polluted, and those four things between them spell real trouble. So let's have a look first at the question of water. So far in June, we would have thought that we've got enough water to last us forever, but it's actually not like that. On the face of it, you'd say, well, what water shortage? The annual world rainfall is approximately 27,000 cubic miles. There's an awful lot of water, of which 8% is used in agriculture, 1% is used in the city, and over 90% isn't used at all. So, you know, where's the water shortage? It doesn't really make sense. But, you know, Julian Cribb says that water shortage is a real problem. He said in the last 4 decades of the 20th century, the amount of fresh water available for each human being worldwide shrank by almost 2/3. It's expected to be halved again by 2025. And such stark numbers have prompted a number of observers to assert the world has already passed peak water. Supply is now declining, both per capita and relative to demand. And this poses a serious hazard to our ability to maintain, let alone double, world food supplies. So this obviously, there's got to be something wrong somewhere. So when Julian Cribb talks about the fresh water available, he means the fresh water which is cheaply available. Of course you can get more fresh water, but it's costly to do so, and the capitalists, in the interest of profit, can't afford to spend money unnecessarily. They just grab hold of the cheap sources of supply, and everybody else goes to the wall. You see, if we had a planned economy, a planned socialist economy, then so long as water is needed, resources are made available for even the most painstaking methods, because there's no competition to make this activity, quotes, uneconomic. In a market economy, not only are the incentives weak for capitalists to pursue expensive production methods, but in addition, the capitalists who control the sources of easy water often help themselves without thought either for the future or for their neighbours.
Or to starve their neighbours.
So Magdoff and Locke think that this is even more the case with the multinational conglomerates, which are gradually taking over the world's farmland. Their book eulogises natural peasant farming, but they forget that the peasants tend to be both too poor and too dispersed to be able to take the necessary measures to preserve the world's water resources to the extent that is now necessary, even if they manage a little bit better than multinationals. So in a capitalist economy, it's every man for himself, and those rich enough to afford mechanical pumps to pump out groundwater do so, and they then extract more than nature can replace. This, in turn, threatens the water supplies in future years, often done at the expense of neighbours who find their wells running dry. It empties the rivers, it empties the lakes, it empties the wetlands. It kills the landscapes on higher ground. The water table sinks so low that the roots don't reach. And in India, groundwater is falling by 3 feet a year, which leaves a great deal of land, especially that belonging to poorer farmers, drying up. But in all this scenario, Cribb still thinks that there are very many ways in which the looming global water crisis can be alleviated, and that most of them are within our technical abilities. But then he says, oh dear, even governments tend to fail to promote these measures. They lack the collective willpower to do what's necessary. But you see, what he doesn't see is this collective willpower doesn't have any scope to assert itself under the conditions of capitalism, where it's the dividend to the shareholders and the multi-million pound salaries and bonuses of the managers that are the driving force of capitalist enterprises. It's the lust for profit that determines action and not collective willpower. You know, both governments and international bodies such as the IMF and the World Bank are merely agents for the imposition of bourgeois willpower, not collective willpower. And it's well known that through the IMF's structural adjustment programs, not only millions of individuals, but even whole countries have been bankrupted to such an extent that neglect of food production environment has been unavoidable. And measures that were previously taken by governments of oppressed countries to support peasant farmers have been, as we've already seen, permanently discontinued at the insistence of the IMF. These measures are stigmatized as anti-competitive, putting the products of the poor old multinationals at a disadvantage, and they're therefore forbidden. But as a Spaniard, I found a very nice example for you. Now this is to do with desalination plants. Obviously desalination is a very expensive way of producing fresh water, but it's pretty effective. And an award-winning 300 million euro desalination plant at Torrevieja on Spain's arid southeast coast, it is arid too, except when I go there, is Europe's largest facility for converting seawater into fresh, and the second biggest in the world. Finished last year, the plant is idle, and likely to be so for at least another 18 months. Neither the pipes to the sea, nor the power transmission lines have been approved or built, and even if it does begin to process seawater, the product may be so expensive that nobody wants to buy it. With a heated dispute brewing in Brussels over rising EU spending at a time of austerity, how can you waste money on desalination plants? Plus tensions between Europe's fiscally self-righteous north and poorer neighbours in the south, the fate of the plant will be watched across the continent. 3 years ago, Barcelona was so stricken by drought that it imported water by the shipload from Tarragona and Marseille in France. Today, it has a new desalination plant capable of producing a fifth of the area's water supply. But with the price of oil high because of political turmoil in the Middle East and abundant rain having fallen across much of Spain over the past 2 years, the omens aren't good in the short term for the high-cost desalination plants on the Iberian Peninsula. So that's the Financial Times reporting that in the end of April. So, you know, this is how financial considerations get in the way of planning and ecological. So you'll be pleased to hear that China is still able, from the socialist sector of its economy, to undertake major works in terms of water accessibility. And at the moment, there's a network of mighty canals urgently being built along 3 main routes to shift supplies from south to north. So
You mean like a national system?
a national system.
My God, it seems like
So what you want to do is to take the water from up the mountains where, you know, there's no soil, and bring it to the places where there is soil. So if we can move on then to the question of the land. With land as much as with water, for profit exploitation results most frequently in failure to maintain soil quality to the detriment of future crops. And of course, once you lose the soil quality, it's actually exceptionally difficult to replace it. Land is obviously a finite resource, unlike the potential growth of the human population, and therefore it is alarming at first sight to see that whereas in 1960 there were 4.1 acres per person of cultivable land in the world, this is now down to 0.6 acres, and it's expected to reduce to 0.4 by 2050. And worse than that, 1% of productive land is degraded every year, and by 2050 this will add up to a 65% reduction in productive land in the world if things carry on as they are. Well, let's have a look at Andrew Hoff writing in the Telegraph. British farming soil could run out within 60 years. It's being lost faster than it can be replenished. It'll eventually lead to the topsoil bank becoming empty. An estimated 75 billion tonnes of soil is lost annually, with more than 80% of the world's farming land moderately or severely eroded. Even in China, the soil is being lost 57 times faster than it can be replaced through natural processes. In Europe, the figure is 17 times, America 10 times, and 5 times in Australia. So world soil could vanish, including European and British soils, could vanish within about 60 years if drastic action isn't taken. But who's going to take the drastic action? So it's partly loss of groundwater. Now this apparently has the effect of causing soluble arsenic to build up in the soil. Well, that's So long as it remains in a sort of crystal state, that's not a problem. But what then happens is that it rains and it pollutes the soil, and it's then poisonous. You eat anything off there and you're writhing in agony. Secondly, the felling of rainforests, which people do to try and provide more soil to grow things, actually causes over-acidity and sterility. And 750,000 square miles was estimated to have been rendered for this reason. Then there's the loss of soil to urban spread. Now, towns are often built in very fertile areas or in the middle of very fertile areas, and as they spread, with all the people, impoverished people coming to live on the outskirts of the towns spread, and they spread over fertile ground, which is obviously then lost to production. Whatever the reason for it, there is global warming. It is causing seawater levels to rise, and we can expect them to flood out some of the delta regions, which up to now have been some of the most fertile areas of the world. Now, the Malthusians are going to jump up and down here and say, well, of course we've got far too many people. There's this growing human population. We've got, it's because we've got too many people. That's why we've got this problem. But what they never realise is that the more people you've got, then the more physical and mental power that you have got to actually solve the problems, if you mobilise them. The more human beings, the more solutions.
Yeah.
Well, that's not necessarily under capitalism, right?
No, what we have, we haven't got too many people, we've got too many capitalists.
That's right. The problem is to ensure that this human resource is fully mobilised to solve the problems that we've identified. And that's obviously not the case, where billions of people are left languishing in unemployment and underemployment in the world's slums. So of all the resources that capitalism wastes in cavalier fashion, the human resource is by far and away the most significant. To win the war of competition, every capitalist, to keep costs to a minimum, mobilises as few workers as he possibly can, leaving vast numbers without any productive occupation. But in order to ensure that sufficient supplies of food are produced on limited land resources, it's necessary to keep increasing the output per acre. It also requires a reversal of this soil degradation that we've seen. And this is an onerous but essential task. And it requires, according to Professor Crawford, who's a former chair of the UK Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council's Agri-Food Committee, it requires minimum ploughing, improved management, it requires resting of soil by crop rotation basically. And even so, it's going to take decades to put the soil back to where it was. But it does require hands-on deck. More than that, it requires the appliance of science, it requires research, it requires training. But as we've seen in this period of crisis, all the training facilities, research facilities are all being cut back and preserved for people who can pay to take courses in accounting and management and law and everything that isn't much used except under capitalism, marketing, for instance. Now, then there's the question of fertilizer. Now, fertilizers have enormously increased the productivity of soil, but they are leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. They leak into the environment. The way they're applied by the multinationals using minimum labour power is to sort of flood the area with far more than is necessary. And so the surplus pollutes water sources, pollutes the sea, and causes soil acidity. But the main problem, obviously, is that the fertilizer comes from finite resources. Most of it comes from oil. It's an oil byproduct. And when oil runs out, well, so does fertilizer. So systems need to be developed and installed that ensure that fields receive only as much as by way of fertilizer that's going to be taken up, avoiding leakage, waste and pollution. And alternative sources of fertilizer have to be developed. The most obvious being to use city waste. for which recycling plants need to be developed and built, and delivery systems that aren't heavily fuel dependent. The possibilities are also presented by artificial photosynthesis. I moved on to the C there. And the possibilities need to be explored and put into practice, but they also require the building of massive works like China's canals, infrastructure, more research, more training to be made widely available. So then finally I turn to the sea, as it were. Well, we all know about overfishing, and it's obvious to anybody that if fish stocks are wiped out, then a valuable source of protein disappears forever. And if the issue of overfishing at its current rate is left unresolved, fish protein that could be made available is going to fall short very soon by 100 million tonnes. Now, if you wanted to try and produce that 100 million tonnes of protein on land, you'd have to double the irrigation water to grow the grain that would feed the livestock that would produce that protein. But that's not possible under present conditions, and so for the sake of the future of humanity, then this problem really does have to be solved. Research and development is needed into how fish farming can be made less ecologically damaging, and this apparently could possibly be done by cultivation of marine plants alongside the fish farming. But who under capitalism is going to finance the research, who's going to put in the infrastructure to enable this to be done, when the only result will be that you're going to produce fish expensively rather than to pull it out of the sea cheaply. Nobody's, with the profit motive, nobody's going to do it. There are those who believe that eventually all these problems are going to be solved by capitalism, and you have to admit that if there's enough money, possibility of profit involved, you might get some capitalists pouring a lot of money into solving one problem or another, even building a canal or whatever. But all the same, this is going to be very much the exception that proves the rule. So, but the sort of upbeat sort of comments that people make. This is somebody called Tom Vilsack, who is the US Agriculture Secretary, and of course he's handsomely paid to defend capitalism at his salary, even I might. But he says, but today, only a few years after a devastating food crisis, we can avoid the mistakes of 2000 and 2008 and respond to this challenge as a country and a globe. To do so, we must work with other governments to help those most vulnerable to spikes in food prices and put in place the fundamentals to feed a rapidly growing population. This means encouraging all nations to pursue policies that limit price volatility while identifying vulnerable populations and responding appropriately. Shall we drop a few bombs on mud? In the short term, nations should embrace transparency and the free movement of food supplies. They should share information on stocks and production, abstain from export bans while using export quotas and taxes sparingly, avoid panic buying and hoarding, reduce import tariffs and taxes, and put in place targeted safety nets for the most vulnerable. Oh, don't we love the American government? They're so thoughtful. In the long term, worldwide agriculture has a steep hill to climb. The global population's on the rise, and strong economic growth in developing countries is expanding middle classes and increasing demand for agricultural products. We will have to increase food production by 70% to feed a global population of 9 billion by 2050. To prepare, we need a concerted effort by the private sector, governments and multilateral institutions to increase transparency and market information, increase agricultural productivity and facilitate trade. And he actually calls his article How to Avoid a Global Food Price Crisis. So, well, there you are.
He probably lies to his wife as well.
Notice he says food price crisis and not food crisis.
Yes.
And you get some sort of similar stuff from the GAFSP, which is the Global Agriculture Food Security Program, run by the World Bank.
And spelled with an M rather than double M-E.
Oh, absolutely, yes. the program is specifically targeted to supporting food security in countries that have made credible efforts to devise and fund inclusive and peer-reviewed agricultural investment plans. It'll help people in rural areas by financing high-yield agricultural technologies, connecting farmers to markets, reducing risks and vulnerability to income shocks and weather events. Weren't they doing that all right until these people came along? But anyway, that's by the way. Improving off-farm livelihoods for people in rural areas and providing technical assistance to help governments deal with food insecurity. But really, although they say they have the power to avoid a global food price crisis, all you get is in practical wishful thinking. You know, you've only got to open your newspapers and you'll see article after article saying, demonstrating that under capitalism the only values are those that turn into profit. Usefulness to humanity just doesn't count for anything.
You don't know the meaning of the word.
Even when even when the use in question is actually the most dire need.
We don't know.
As we've seen in relation to the desalination plants in Spain, the cyclical economic crisis cuts away any economic slack that might otherwise have existed. You know, US imperialism is actually cutting back the aid to oppressed countries that could possibly, in theory, have been used to develop the infrastructure that the World Bank is waxing eloquent about. The New York Times, commenting on the food crisis, says the Obama administration has proposed worthy initiatives, but even when Democrats controlled Congress, it had a hard time getting the money. The administration has committed $570 million towards its pledge of $3.5 billion between 2010 and 2012. A World Bank fund that got $66 million from the United States will only administer part of the global aid effort. It's now asking for $408 million for the fund, part of a $1.64 billion request for its Feed the Future initiative, which aims to bolster poor countries' food production capacities. Congressional Republicans are determined to hack as much as they can out of the foreign aid. The continuing resolution passed by the House cuts $80 million out of the food aid budget, bringing it down to about $1 billion, roughly where it was in 2001. In a crisis, there's little will to cooperate among the world's economic powers. It's every country for itself. And in 2008, the US criticized China for prohibiting the export of fertilizer and grain. China had to do this at that time to keep Chinese food prices in check, because obviously if it didn't keep prices in check at home, then the Chinese people were likely to make themselves difficult. But the result was that outside China, fertilizer supply was greatly reduced in relation to demand, and its price shot up nearly $50 a bag, which put it completely out of reach for millions of small peasant farmers, and to the obvious detriment of food production. But of course the bourgeois media are happy to use the example of China to highlight this problem. But you know, they're the kings of protectionism. They can far outstrip China as far as protectionist measures are concerned. For years, both the US and Europe have been heavily subsidizing their farmers, and to the detriment of the peasants of the Third World. But they have to do it if they're going to avoid rebellion at home. You know, protectionism is going to definitely happen. And of course, an additional destabilizing factor that militates against any kind of capitalist planning for the future is speculation, which plays havoc with prices, with the result that many smaller farmers are driven out of business. And I found a nice bit here from Kaufman on a website called newsnow.org on the 27th of April, how Goldman Sachs created the food crisis. Well, he's trying to put it all down to speculation. Well, of course, it's not all down to speculation, but speculation certainly has a role to play. And he says, the money tells the story. Since the bursting of the tech bubble in 2000, there's been a 50-fold increase in dollars invested in commodity index funds, like commodities which includes food. To put the phenomenon in real terms, in 2003 the commodities futures market like the future price you pay for wheat or whatever, still totaled a sleepy 13 billion. But when the global financial crisis sent investors running scared in early 2008, and as dollars, pounds and euros evaded investor confidence, commodities, including food, seemed like the last best place for hedge, pension and sovereign wealth funds to park their cash. You had people who had no clue what commodities were all about suddenly buying commodities, an analyst from the US Department of Agriculture told me. In the first 55 days of 2008, speculators poured $55 billion into commodity markets, and by July, $318 billion was roiling the markets. Food inflation has remained steady since. The money flowed, and the bankers were ready with a sparkling new casino of food derivatives, spearheaded by oil and gas prices, the dominant commodities of the index funds. The new investment products ignited the markets of all other index commodities, which led to a problem familiar to those versed in the history of tulips, dot-coms and cheap real estate, a food bubble. And so from 2005 to 2008, the worldwide price of food rose 80% and has kept rising. But the boom in new speculative opportunities in global grain, edible oil and livestock markets has created a vicious circle. The more the price of food commodities increases, the more money pours into the sector and the higher the prices rise. Indeed, from 2003 to 2008, the volume of index fund speculation increased by 1,900%. The result of Wall Street's venture into grain and feed and livestock has been a shock to the global food production and delivery system. Not only does the world's food supply have to contend with constricted supply and increased demand for real grain, but investment bankers have engineered an artificial upward pull on the price of grain futures. The result? Imaginary wheat dominates the price of real wheat, traditionally 1/5 of the market, as speculators now outnumber bona fide hedgers 4 to 1. And in fact, in today's Sunday Telegraph, there's a bit saying that an article by Richard Tyler entitled "Farmers Hedge on Crop Prices," and he says that farmers are being forced to become financial experts as well as technicians in animal husbandry and land management, as rapidly rising input costs make them more vulnerable to price shocks. So they're having to pore over the pages of the Financial Times and, deal in futures and try and hedge and buy stuff in advance and sell part in advance in order to stabilize the prices at which their inputs are available to them. So we can see how a market economy with the profit motive is an unavoidable driving force that leaves a considerable proportion of the human population hungry, despite the production of plenty, but is also relentlessly undermining future food supplies. The activities of the speculators are the poisonous icing on a poisonous cake, and even without the speculators, the cake would remain poisonous. But the petty bourgeois reformists do strive to present capitalism as being capable of being moderated, if not cured. And this is a position expressly or implicitly expressed by the various, relatively progressive authors that I've been quoting today. And so we have somebody called Peter Rossett writing in the Magdoff book. He says, well, what we find is a clash of two models of agricultural production. The dominant model, which generated the recent crisis, consists of industrial monocultures produced by agribusinesses. Unfortunately for local consumers, agribusiness does not typically produce food for local populations. Rather, agribusiness has an export vocation. Either commodities are produced for export markets, or biomass is grown to produce ethanol or biodiesel to feed cars instead of human beings. Just as troubling is the technology that agribusiness uses. Soils are eroded, compacted, sterilized and increasingly infertile. Pests become resistant to ever-rising doses of pesticides. This kind of agriculture is heavily dependent on petroleum. Dear, dear. But in contrast to agribusiness, family farmers and peasants.
More
Yes.
peasants, that's the way forward.
That's the future.
Typically do produce food for local and national markets. In country after country, the proportion of food coming from the small farm sector is far greater, typically more than double the proportion of land that's actually in the hands of small farmers. These farmers are overrepresented in food production, underrepresented in export and agro-fuel production, because they have a food-producing vocation. Yet continued growth of the dominant model directly undermines food production, driving small farmers off the land. And in order to reverse these trends and provide a life with dignity for farming peoples, protect rural environments, correct the structural causes of the food crisis, we need to revitalize family and peasant farming. This means restoring the public sector rural budgets that were cut under neoliberal policies. Some hope. Restoring minimum price guarantees, credit and other forms of support, and undertaking redistributive agrarian reform.
Yeah, take the land away from
No,
us.
I'm really gambling.
Yes, well, so these impassioned words do rather overlook the fact that if local for farmers and peasants market, the agribusinesses are producing for the world market and in fact are feeding millions of people. It does require large-scale farms to which the latest scientific methods can be applied to ensure maximum increase in yields. But just because in a world dominated by imperialism, the large-scale farms belong to and are operated by profiteering enterprises, which in the pursuit of profit are driven to neglect the principles of good husbandry in the most egregious fashion, it doesn't mean that large-scale farming itself has necessarily always and at all times to be blighted in this way. You know, the good news is that while it takes capitalism in pursuit of its self-expansion to give rise to the mass socialization of production in the world, the resulting contradiction that's introduced between social production and private appropriation lays the basis for humanity to resolve the contradiction by socializing appropriation, i.e. by expropriating the exploiting class, abolishing exploitation altogether, and moving history forward to a new and more civilized stage, where both war and hunger phenomena of the past soon to be forgotten, as the whole of humanity cooperates in the struggle against the forces of nature. Now, once capitalism has been abolished, a task which the facts put forward in this article indicate is a somewhat urgent task, the best way of producing a decent livelihood for farmers and peasants, at the same time as ensuring optimum standards of husbandry and ever-increasing yields for a growing and more prosperous population, is for food production to be concentrated in large state farms, with production quotas set by planning authorities in consultation with local producers, who will advise not only as to how much they can realistically be expected to produce, but also on the measures that need to be taken to ensure sustainability and expansion of production in the future. And of course the proletarian state will have the power to actually implement the measures that are needed. So with an eye to the future, state planners can set aside the resources. You know, they don't have to worry about paying dividends or managerial bonuses. They'll set aside the resources for research into ways of solving the problems that have appeared in the practical course of food production. They're able to set up mass training programs to ensure farmers are well versed in the possibilities offered by modern science. They're able to mobilize the farmers themselves to train other farmers. They can make available to the countryside new machinery of a kind that farmers of small parcels of land could never afford. They can ensure the latest seeds are freely available in areas where they're most likely to thrive. And for massive problems such as those facing food production at the present time, it's really only through state planning that it's going to be possible to be sure that appropriately massive resources are allocated to finding the solutions to these problems and then putting those solutions into effect in a thoroughgoing and comprehensive manner. And it's absurd to look to capitalism to solve these problems. You know, Rossett's dream of a system subsidizing small peasants producing on small farms simply lacks the means of solving the world's food production problems. Besides which, you know, so long as there's capitalism, it's the rich who have the power which they wield purely and simply to increase their wealth and their power. So this means the small proprietor is doomed, while the petty bourgeois intelligentsia stands sorrowfully by, wringing its hands. And I actually looked at Hapal's book, Imperialism, Decadent, Parasitic, Moribund Capitalism, written 10 years ago. Now, when he wrote it, Magdoff and Cribb hadn't produced their text, but, you know, Hapal has sort of more or less anticipated their arguments. And he wrote, the yoke of monopolies on the several billion inhabitants of our planet has become so unbearable that it's spawned an enormous amount of literature written from an utterly petty bourgeois standpoint in criticism of monopolies. This petty bourgeois critique, even though it contains enormously valuable and irrefutable facts and statistics drawn from sources with solid bourgeois credentials, accompanied though it is with passionate denunciations of corporate colonialism and a deeply felt concern for the lives of billions of poor people around the world, nevertheless remains for all this impotent and reactionary. Impotent because it appeals to the very forces which in the pursuit of profit cannot but devastate the lives of the overwhelming part of humanity and destroy the earth, beseeching them to act more responsibly and take into account the interests of the people and ecological considerations when making their business decisions. Reactionary because it harks back to the days of pre-monopoly, of free competition, to the times of Adam Smith and even earlier, for a solution to the problems facing humanity today. Totally oblivious to the fact that free competition, so beloved of the petty bourgeois, gives rise to the concentration of production, which in turn, at a certain stage of development, necessarily leads to monopoly. You know, Marx, by his theoretical and historical analysis, proved this long ago. So, in the present situation of a worsening world economic crisis, we've seen that the exploiting classes are even less amenable to allowing good profit to be diverted into the support of the exploited and oppressed masses. Any kind of sentimentality on their part would only too likely lead to their financial ruin and would be a totally unaffordable luxury. In a period of crisis, the bourgeoisie does everything to save itself from ruin at the expense of the masses, both at home and in the oppressed countries. The wages and social benefits paid to the workers reduce drastically, while taxes are increased, both to pay for bank bailouts for the benefit of the rich, and for wars that the rich wage in order to maintain and extend their power and domination. It's thus not only the world's peasants who are being ruined, but also the world's proletarians whose lives are being made every day more unbearable as a result of intensifying poverty and endless war. The question is, do you support these workers and peasants in their effort to put an end to capitalism and usher in the era that corresponds with fully socialized production as it exists today, i.e. the socialist era? You know, rest assured that the contradictions of the capitalist system, which drive the masses to ruin in the midst of plenty, will continue to force the exploited and oppressed towards revolution, however vicious the repression unleashed on them. Utopian dreams and wishful thinking have no place in the raw confrontation between oppressor and oppressed. History has decreed that the proletariat will sooner or later finally be victorious. And in view of the urgent necessity of replacing capitalism because of the damage being caused by its depredations to the ability of humanity to feed itself, which our petty bourgeois intellectuals have so comprehensively exposed, we urge them to rise above their funk, stop endorsing ridiculously hopeless pipe dreams of rational, manageable and humanitarian imperialism, and start backing the proletariat as it fights to secure its historical right to seize the reins of state power. The time has come for the meek to inherit the earth. Let no one seek to impede their right to claim their inheritance.